A mysterious ruin in southern Africa rises out of the highland plains. These walls have been empty for centuries and were considered old before the first European settlers arrived here. The African people who lived around the ruins, the Shona, called them Great Zimbabwe, or stone houses, but they offered few clues to what happened to the people who lived here. In the 1800s, European colonists who first saw the structures did not believe that Africans could have built them. Instead, they thought the houses were the product of an ancient white civilization that disappeared thousands of years ago. Europeans admired African art, but they considered African science and technology to be inferior. They believed that Europeans were superior to Africans, who they thought were primitive and incapable of building complex structures. Zimbabwe was a problem for European scholars. If native Africans had built this complex of granite walls and towers, it was proof that they were not inferior after all. Europeans turned to a German geologist, Karl Mauch, for an explanation. Mauch tried to take credit for Zimbabwe away from native Africans and make European domination seem like a natural condition. Mauch was not the only one with a theory about Zimbabwe. Cecil Rhodes was a driving force behind the European colonization of southern Africa, and he was determined to prove the theory that Great Zimbabwe had been the capital of an ancient Phoenician colony. To prove his theory, Rhodes hired Richard Hall to inspect the ruins. It was Hall's job to protect Great Zimbabwe, but in his eagerness to find evidence of the Phoenicians, he stripped the ruins of all its artifacts. Archaeologists in England raised a huge outcry over Hall's poor treatment of the site, and they demanded that he be replaced.
So an unbiased professional archaeologist was sent in by the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1906, a fellow by the name of David Randall McIver, who conducted brief excavations in what was left of archaeological deposits at the site, and came to the conclusion that they were entirely of African origin and medieval in date, and he even estimated the age for the elliptical building at somewhere in the 15th century due to his knowledge of the Chinese glassware found in the site.
McIver found that Great Zimbabwe had been part of a thriving African culture. It was home to skilled artisans and stonemasons who built the complex, and it was a magnet for trade from as far away as China. In the 1300s, Europe was in the Middle Ages, but Great Zimbabwe's master masons began work on their most enduring monument, the Great Enclosure. McIver's findings shocked the white-dominated government of Rhodesia, where Great Zimbabwe stood. At the time, the idea that Africans were capable of an achievement on such a scale disproved the colonial view that Africans were uncivilized. The Rhodesian government rejected McIver's findings and covered up the truth until 1929, when English archaeologist Gertrude Caton Thompson confirmed his findings. In 1979, after years of civil war, Rhodesia came under black majority rule. The new government changed the name of the country to Zimbabwe, out of respect for the ancient culture that had come before them. Today, much remains unknown about the rise and fall of Great Zimbabwe. But the people of present-day Zimbabwe will continue to explore their past. And with the help of archaeologists, it is possible that we may one day uncover the long-hidden secrets of the men and women who built this medieval wonder.
Europe in the year 1200 was a tough and dangerous place. Society was strictly divided into social classes. This system was called feudalism, and it governed the relationships between a lord or landowner and his servants. Wealthy and powerful noblemen called lords fought each other for control of the land and the people who lived on it. A lord's strength depended on his ability to defend his land and his property. To do so, he needed two things: a castle and an army. The best sites for castles were high on a mountain or on the banks of a river or atop a rocky cliff. Attacking a castle built in one of these locations was difficult. There was usually only one direction from which you could approach a castle, and that side was carefully guarded. For extra insurance against attackers, a trench with water, called a moat, might surround the castle. Watchtowers manned by armed soldiers were built at intervals along the outside wall. The stone walls ranged from 12 to 20 feet thick. Inside these defenses were the courtyard, some smaller buildings, and the Lord's castle, called a keep, because the noble and his family were kept there. Life inside the castle, even during peaceful times, was anything but luxurious. After all, defense and safety were the main considerations. Comfort took a back seat. The building itself was cold and drafty. An army of servants was needed to keep warm fires going 24 hours a day. There were only a few actual bedrooms. The Lord, his family, and often his servants shared one bedroom. Toilets were built into the outer wall and might end in a ditch or the moat. The kitchens were just a group of sheds in the courtyard. Food was unlikely to arrive hot at the table after being carried through the open air and up the drafty staircases. The center of activity in the castle was the Great Hall, a large open room where family and guests gathered to conduct business or eat and relax. A chapel-worthy household could attend Mass reflected the importance of the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. Feudalism influenced every aspect of life in the Middle Ages. Under feudalism, the noblemen who owned the land owned the common people, called peasants, who lived on the land. The noblemen made all the laws and settled disputes, usually in the castle's Great Hall. Peasants worked the land for the Lord, and in return were allowed to keep a little food for themselves. They also received the protection of their Lord's army. These medieval armies were composed of soldiers called knights, some of whom were land-owning noblemen themselves. Knighthood was a great honor, and there were two ways to achieve it. You could inherit the title from your father, or you could work your way up. Either way, men trained for knighthood from the time they were young boys. A future knight learned to ride a horse, and he learned the rules of chivalry, including skill in arms, loyalty to his lord, generosity, courtesy, and service to God. At around age 13, he joined a noble's house as a squire, where he learned to use weapons and to care for horses and armor. Around the age of 20, the squire became a knight. During the 15th century, the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, a rebirth of intellectual activity that led to new ideas about government and the role of the church. Feudalism collapsed, and the age of chivalry and shining knights became the stuff of legend.
The Middle Ages began when the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century. This period lasted for hundreds of years. Without the Romans to provide protection, medieval Europe became a violent and dangerous place. frequent foreign invasions by Vikings, Magyars, Muslims, and other raiders weakened European rulers so that they could not maintain law and order. Seizing the opportunity, wealthy nobles seeking to expand their power and land holdings began fighting one another for territory. Out of this chaos emerged a new political and social system called feudalism. Because European kings weren't strong enough to control the battling nobles who were challenging their power, they struck a deal with them instead. In a formal ceremony, a monarch would give a noble a fief, or grant of land. The monarch also promised to protect the noble. In exchange, the noble swore an oath of loyalty, vowing to be faithful to his lord, the monarch, and to supply him with armed warriors and other services. Through this feudal contract, the noble became the vassal of a king or queen. The monarch's vassals became lords themselves by subdividing their fiefs and acquiring vassals of their own. Like their overlords, these lesser nobles had to publicly promise their loyalty and support in return for land and protection. Often the same man was both lord and vassal, lord to a less powerful noble below him, and vassal to a more powerful noble above him. Feudal society had a strict social order. The monarch was at the top. Directly below him were the upper nobility. Even though they were below the king, it was these local lords who controlled most people's lives. The social hierarchy continued down through the rest of society. Just under the nobility were the knights, mounted warriors who did battle for their lords. Nobles also sometimes hired men-at-arms, soldiers who had the same equipment as knights, but not their social standing. The peasants were at the bottom of the social order. They were generally poor, uneducated laborers who lived and worked on the land owned by the nobles. The peasants were the economic backbone of society, growing the crops and producing the other goods that everyone needed. The peasants were considered part of the land they lived on. When a noble received a fief of land, he received the peasants who lived on it too. Peasants couldn't leave the land without the lord's permission, and they had to obey the lord's laws. They also had to work for the lord, farming his lands and giving him regular payments of what they produced. In return, the peasants were allowed to farm some of the lord's land for themselves. Perhaps more important during this chaotic period, they enjoyed the stability and protection of the lord's laws and his armies. These were big benefits during the Middle Ages, when competing lords, bandits, and raiders from outside Europe were a serious threat. A main source of protection during the Middle Ages was a castle. An army that was barricaded inside a castle was incredibly difficult to defeat. And nobles safe inside their castles were able to build up their armies and expand their power. But the castles were more than just strongholds for the nobility. They also protected the entire community. During times of trouble, the local peasants gathered for safety inside the castle walls and often helped to defend the castle. Under feudalism, the overlords, lesser lords, knights, and peasants all depended on one another for survival. Life may not have been easy for most people, but feudalism turned chaos into order and offered stability during a violent and uncertain age. The battle to control the Holy Lands began more than 1,000 years ago. In medieval times, European Christians set out on a series of crusades to try to win back the region from its Muslim rulers. It was a struggle between not only armies, but faiths. Over the course of 2 centuries, from 1096 to 1291, the Crusaders launched 8 major expeditions and countless smaller efforts. Return to the year 1095. The Christian world is split. In the West, Roman Catholic Europe is a collection of small states and kingdoms. To the east, the Orthodox Christian Byzantine Empire is controlled from Constantinople, which would later become Istanbul in Turkey. In the Middle East, Accra is a lively Muslim city on the coast of modern-day Israel. Accra is the gateway to the Holy Land. Just to the south lies Jerusalem, a city sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. In a speech in France, Pope Urban II tries to unite Eastern and Western Christians by calling for them to unite to liberate the Holy Land. The speech ignites religious fervor across Europe. From princes to peasants, tens of thousands take up the cross, as going on crusade is called.
The First Crusade is kind of a hodgepodge. It's not a fancy military enterprise. A lot of people and a lot of common people become involved. It's a great popular movement.
The main armies of the First Crusade finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, nearly 4 years after Urban issued his call to arms. The city's perimeters are impressive. Fortified walls surround Jerusalem, but the Crusader engineers find a weak spot, not in the walls, but in the landscape.
This is actually the spot where the Crusaders breached the walls of the old city. It was the spot that throughout history has been used, because this is the flattest area in Jerusalem. In the northern part of the city right here, that's where Jerusalem can only be defeated.
July 7th, the battle for Jerusalem begins. Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders 8 days later. The Christians overwhelm the city's defenders. The battle becomes a massacre. Historians estimate that between 10,000 and 20,000 Muslims are killed. The Crusaders also burn a synagogue filled with Jews who had sought sanctuary inside.
It was seen as barbaric, uncalled for, and it created a great demand for revenge and retaliatory action.
For more than 80 years, the Christians managed to keep a weak hold on the Holy Land. Then a warrior steps forward to conquer and unify much of the Muslim Middle East. His name is Saladin.
There is no modern political leader you can compare to Salahuddin.
Here you have a man who was a convinced, pious Muslim, but he was also a realistic ruler. He was not a naive innocent. He was not a saint. By and large, there's no denying that Saladin is a hero.
Christian and Muslim armies meet again at the Battle of Hattin, near Accra. This time, Muslim archers give Saladin the advantage. The entire Crusader force is killed or taken prisoner.
Hattin is important because this is where Salahuddin establishes himself as a military genius. It is Hattin and the fall of Hattin that really opens up and turns round the Crusades.
After Saladin's decisive victory at Hattin, he takes back the port city of Accra. 3 months later, in 1188, the Muslims win the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. Saladin enters Jerusalem in triumph. He takes control of the holiest Christian shrine in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Instead of destroying the church, Saladin opens its doors to Christian pilgrims, many of them members of competing religious groups. To prevent one Christian faction from shutting out the other, Saladin places the keys of the church in the hands of 2 Muslim families. Their descendants remain the gatekeepers of the church to this day. Saladin's generosity fails to impress the European rulers, who declare another crusade with a new leader.
Richard the Lionheart was a war lover. He was the greatest warrior of his time, a great athlete.
June 7th, 1191, a 34-year-old English king sets foot in the Holy Land at the port city of Accra. Pulling Accra apart brick by brick will take too long. To conquer the fort, Richard's army needs a shortcut. The solution? portable attack platforms called siege towers. Rolled up to the enemy wall, the soldiers climbed stairways to the top of Acre's walls. July 12, 1191, little more than a month after Richard's arrival, the city of Acre falls to the Crusaders. Richard and Saladin never do meet in person, but on September 2nd, 1192, the two great warriors make peace. The terms: Acre stays a Christian stronghold. Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands. But Saladin guarantees safe passage for pilgrims of all faiths to the Holy City. The religious access to Jerusalem forged by Richard and Saladin outlives them both. Over the next 100 years, several attempts to retake Jerusalem fail. Instead, Muslim forces have slowly won back much of the region. By summer 1290, Acre remains the last major Christian foothold in the Holy Land. Here, Europeans trade goods and ideas freely with the Muslims. But the dialogue soon breaks down as Muslim and Christian leaders renew their power struggle. By this time, most Europeans have lost their taste for crusading. Acre's Christian defenders are no match for the Muslim army. Never again do the Crusaders control a part of the Holy Lands.
The fall of Acre in 1291 was a key event. It was the end of the story. It was the last major enclave to fall.
The Crusades left an estimated 1 million people dead. While they did open a dialogue between Christians and Muslims, the repercussions of those long-ago battles are still being felt today.
During the middle of the 14th century, plague spread across Europe, killing millions of people. It is estimated that more than 25 million died during the first outbreak, which lasted from about 1347 to 1353. The Black Death, as it was later named, was so devastating that many thought it would destroy the world. A major cause of the disaster was rats. Rats were everywhere in the Middle Ages, even in the homes of the rich and powerful. They were so common that most people paid them little attention. But rats carried a deadly bacteria in their blood, a bacteria that would kill 1 out of every 3 to 4 people in Europe. But how did the bacteria spread from rats to humans?
The fleas suck blood from their hosts. And that's really how the plague was spread. The flea would go from the rats to the humans and back again. That very action spread the plague even more rapidly as it deposited bacteria. These tiny creatures, pound for pound, must be one of those deadly animals on the planet.
Fleas live on the bodies of animals like rats and feed on their blood. Adult fleas can jump up to 200 times their own length in search of fresh blood. When infected insects make the jump from rats to humans, they carry the plague with them. Once people are infected, they infect others very quickly. Plague had broken out before in East Asia and had gradually spread westward to Europe and North Africa, but had subsided after killing large numbers of people. However, one strain of the disease survived in Mongolia. In the 1200s, Mongol armies conquered city after city in Asia. As they moved across the land, they brought the plague with them from Mongolia to China, and then to the wealthy Black Sea trading city of Kaffa. The Mongols attacked Kaffa in 1347. They fought fiercely, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't capture the walled city. Finally, the Mongols thought of a plan. In a primitive form of biological warfare, the Mongols took the bodies of soldiers who had died from the plague and catapulted them over Kaffa's walls. The people of Kaffa fell victim to the plague, and the Mongols took the city. But before they did, a small group of Italian sailors escaped. They fled Kaffa and sailed back to Europe under cover of night. Some of the sailors were already infected from breathing Kaffa's contaminated air. The rats on the ship took care of the rest. Plague-infested ships like the one from Kaffa carried the Black Death to Mediterranean ports.
When the sailors reached these places, it was as if they had brought evil spirits with them. Every city was poisoned by the contagious pestilence. Men and women died suddenly. While they hugged and kissed us, they were spreading the poison.
The Black Death struck with stunning speed. Within hours, victims developed large, swollen black spots on the skin of their armpits, necks, and thighs. Some gave off an intolerable stench. Others spit or vomited blood. Those who spit blood very rarely recovered. Thousands of people fled the cities for their lives. They left their homes and their loved ones and headed for what they hoped was the safety of the countryside. Many people realized that the spread of the disease had something to do with the movement of people and trade between countries. But leaders who might have taken action had other problems. The church was in upheaval, divided by spiritual crisis and scandal. And England and France, two of Europe's kingdoms, were embroiled in the terrible conflict known as the 100 Years' War. Despite war and plague, it was business as usual for European merchants. Goods and rats from the Middle East kept arriving in European ports, and traders moved across the continent selling their wares. In late 1348, trade across the English Channel brought the Black Death to England. Soon the plague killed about a third of the people in London. Giant emergency burial sites, like this one at the Charterhouse Monastery, were created to handle the dead. Then, as quickly as it came, the plague was gone. But it would return several times until the 18th century.
There's probably two reasons why the Black Death outbreak came to an end. One is that the population that survived had some form of natural immunity to the bacillus. The second is that the rats that were carrying the plague themselves died.
The plague, which had ravaged Europe for 6 years, was over for a while. Gradually, Europeans rebuilt their countries and their lives, but memories of the Black Death still remained, and even today arouse fear and horror around the world.
Rome and the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, but the empire did not disappear overnight. In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire, which later became known as the Byzantine Empire, survived another 1,000 years. While the cities of the Western Roman Empire were crumbling, the Byzantine Empire prospered and preserved the heritage and traditions of Rome. But it also borrowed heavily from other traditions. Byzantine civilization blended Christian religion, Greek art, science, and philosophy, and Roman engineering and law. The Byzantine capital, Constantinople, became the new Rome. Built on the ruins of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, Constantinople was located on a major trade route between Europe and Asia. Besides developing into one of Europe's busiest marketplaces, it also became a melting pot where Eastern and Western cultures merged. One of the most striking examples of this cultural blending was Constantinople's church of Hagia Sophia. Rebuilt by the Emperor Justinian in the early 6th century, it combined Greek and Roman building techniques in a new and Eastern-inspired architectural style that quickly became the trademark of Byzantine architecture. This domed structure, almost a city in itself, became the emotional center of the Eastern Christian world. When the Western Roman Empire fell, Byzantium lost most of its European provinces. But by the year 555, new Byzantine armies had reconquered many of them. These conquests, along with trade with Africa, Asia, and Europe, made the Byzantine Empire rich in wealth and culture. Merchants, scholars, and missionaries traveled throughout the Byzantine Empire and beyond, spreading the ideas and writings of a culture built on Greek, Roman, Persian, Egyptian, and other influences. Perhaps the greatest influence of the Byzantines can be seen in Russia. According to an early history, Prince Vladimir of Kiev was so impressed by the wealth and beauty of Byzantine civilization, he adopted Byzantine Christianity and arranged for the mass conversion of his people. Gradually, Russia absorbed not only the religion, but the institutions and culture of the Byzantines. These influences are still seen in the icons of Russian Orthodoxy and the onion-domed churches that dot the Russian landscape. But while Byzantine culture thrived and spread, the political and military power of the empire diminished. In the 7th century, the empire began to shrink, weakened by wars with its Persian, Islamic, Arab, and Slav neighbors. Contributing to this decline was a long-term economic conflict with Venice, a rival trading city in Italy. Venetian merchants and rulers wanted to dominate Mediterranean trade, and they hungered for the wealth of Constantinople. They saw their opportunity in the Crusades, a series of wars between Christians and Muslims over control of the Holy Land. The Venetians persuaded an army of crusaders to attack Constantinople and loot the city in 1204. Arriving on Venetian boats, the European knights stormed the city. For 3 days, the invaders pillaged and plundered. During the chaos, much of the accumulated art and treasure of centuries was destroyed. Most of what was not destroyed was boxed up and shipped to Venice. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered. Over the next 200 years, Constantinople continued to decline. Finally, the empire that had stretched from Spain to Syria was reduced to little more than the walled city-state of Constantinople. Byzantium's end finally came in 1452, when the armies of Sultan Muhammad II of the Ottoman Turks attacked Constantinople. Once again, the city was plundered. But unlike the Venetians, the Ottoman Turks weren't looking to loot the city and leave. They wanted the city itself. The Sultan made the city his capital, and it was eventually renamed Istanbul. He also converted the great church of Hagia Sophia into a mosque. The city that had been the heart of Eastern Christendom for nearly a millennium became a major center of Muslim culture. With the victory of the Ottomans, the Byzantine Empire ended, but the Byzantine legacy remained and influenced generations to come. The Byzantine Empire had preserved the heritage of ancient Rome and mixed it with cultures of Asia. This Byzantine culture that blended traditions of East and West left an enduring influence that continues to this day.
The Ottoman Empire experienced a golden age between 1520 and 1566. During this time, Suleiman led the empire as Sultan, a title given to the ruler of Muslim countries. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire reached the height of its power and prestige. Suleiman turned the capital city of Constantinople, now called Istanbul in present-day Turkey, into the center of a vast Muslim empire that eventually spread to Central Europe, North Africa, and Persia, modern-day Iran. When he first came to power after the death of his father, no one suspected that Suleiman would become the empire's greatest sultan. Muslims respected him and came to call him the lawgiver. He was a patron of literature and the arts. He surrounded himself with writers, painters, and musicians. He even wrote poetry himself. He hired great architects to build magnificent mosques and other buildings throughout the empire. In pursuit of justice, he freed people who had been unjustly imprisoned and fired corrupt bureaucrats. Many people living in the empire were captured slaves. Suleiman allowed some to move up within the ranks of society and government based on their merit and abilities. In fact, his closest advisor, Ibrahim, was a former slave. These new opportunities made the slaves extremely loyal to Suleiman. Suleiman's army was strengthened by attacks on conquered Christians that required them to turn over their young sons to the government. These Christian children were then raised and trained to become Muslim soldiers. The best soldiers joined the ranks of the Janissaries, the elite force of Suleiman's army. Janissaries had to convert to Islam, follow strict rules, display high moral standards, and swear allegiance to the Sultan. Suleiman's army used new military technology that contributed to its success. Muskets provided greater firepower for foot soldiers, and their use of cannons gave the army a huge advantage over most enemies. The Ottoman Empire was a Muslim state, but the empire's diverse population also included Jews and Christians. Although he was a devout Muslim himself, Suleiman realized that forcing a new religion on the cultures he conquered could fuel rebellion. So unlike other rulers of the day, he allowed his conquered subjects to continue worshiping as they always had. As long as he had people's loyalty, they could keep their religion. Muslims called Suleiman the lawgiver because he revised Ottoman laws and improved the justice system. He even made new codes governing the markets and traders that helped turn the empire into the richest in the world. His laws, like those of other Muslim states, were based on the Sharia, the religious law of Islam. By 1540, Suleiman ruled half the civilized world and had the other half trying to buy him off. Suleiman's military victories and enlightened rule led Westerners to call him Suleiman the Magnificent. During his reign, Suleiman expanded the Ottoman Empire to include parts of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. But Suleiman's rule finally weakened and declined because he feared opposition from within his family and among his close advisors. One of Suleiman's wives, Roxolana, an ex-slave, wanted her own son to become Suleiman's heir. She convinced Suleiman that his eldest and most popular son had devised a plot to overthrow him. In 1553, to stop this perceived takeover, Suleiman had his son and many others murdered. Suleiman's rule never recovered from these ruthless actions. The poets he had supported so generously in the past now wrote about him with contempt. Perhaps racked with guilt, Suleiman turned to a life of private seclusion. In 1566, Suleiman, now an old man, led an assault on the Hungarian city of Szigetvar. The 72-year-old Suleiman would not live to see the battle's end. He died in his tent before his troops took the city. But Suleiman had succeeded in bringing prosperity to the Ottoman Empire. He expanded its territory, improved the government and legal systems, strengthened the military, supported the arts, promoted religious tolerance, improved the lives of slaves, and built great mosques and palaces throughout the empire. These achievements remain his greatest legacy. Japan, from around the 1200s to the 1600s, was a feudal society. The emperor presided over a splendid court at Heian, but the real power lay in the hands of a supreme military commander called a shogun. To expand his control, the shogun gave large parcels of land to lesser warlords called daimyo, in return for their agreement to support the shogun with their armies in times of need. The armies were composed of great warriors called samurai. In return for their unswerving loyalty, the daimyo rewarded the samurai with gifts of land. With the aid of the samurai, the daimyo were able to control Japan for more than 400 years. Samurai were known for their great skill with the sword. Their swords sliced swiftly and precisely, making the samurai a deadly opponent. Their extraordinary military prowess was based on extraordinary achievements in technology. The samurai sword had to be hard enough to hold a sharp edge and flexible enough to absorb blows without breaking. Japanese sword makers were among the first to solve this problem, creating a blade that was both sharp and resilient, and they did it more than 800 years ago. The samurai were known not only for the advanced technology of their swords, but also for their ability to use them. Samurai studied martial arts here at the Karshima Grand Shrine. Like a chess player, a samurai always thought several moves ahead. A samurai learned hundreds of combinations of moves and trained relentlessly until his strokes became second nature and his mind, body, and sword moved as one. Hard, flexible swords weren't the samurai's only technological innovation. While Europeans made armor from metal, samurai used a flexible material woven from leather, iron, bamboo, and silk.
日本の鎧は非常に豪華にできてまして、戦いで用いるというよりも何か合戦場における 装束というような趣があるものが日本の甲冑だと思います。
These small plates made of tough rawhide were the building blocks of the armor. The armor maker cut holes for stitching and smoothed each plate before joining them together in a flexible panel. These overlapping panels helped cushion a sword's blow, and because they were flexible, they bent with the blade's impact, which made it difficult for the opponent to do any damage. But 300 years after the samurai rose to power, a new invention changed their way of life forever. In the mid-1500s, a samurai warlord bought a new weapon from Portuguese traders. He turned it over to his master swordsmiths. Within 50 years, the Japanese were making more guns than any country in Europe. Soon warlords were fighting each other with armies of up to 60,000 warriors, including thousands of gunners. To protect their masters against these new weapons, the samurai built large, strong castles throughout Japan. And none shows the brilliance of the samurai's master builders as clearly as Himeji Castle. Its complex system of multiple towers, moats, and walls was designed to confuse and trap invaders. Although many Japanese castles were destroyed in battle, the formidable Himeji was never once attacked, perhaps because no one who saw it could imagine it was possible to take. With the help of the gun, one warlord, Tokugawa Ieyasu, defeated all his rivals in the early 1600s. The Tokugawa shoguns brought an era of peace and stability to Japan. The age of samurai warfare was coming to an end.